There is a strange feeling many people experience the first time they really stop and look closely at photographs of 19th century cities, not just glance at them, but study them carefully. The streets, the buildings, the details carved into stone. At first, everything appears familiar: horse-drawn carriages, people in long coats and hats, smoke drifting from chimneys. It all fits comfortably into the image we carry of the 19th century. And then something begins to feel slightly out of place. The buildings. Massive stone facades rise along entire avenues decorated with columns, arches, sculptures, and intricate masonry. Public buildings stretch across entire city blocks. Railway stations look like palaces. Libraries resemble ancient temples. Even warehouses sometimes display an elegance that feels almost ceremonial. What makes this unsettling is not simply their beauty, it is their scale. These structures appear remarkably mature, architecturally confident, technically precise, and built with materials that seem designed to last centuries. Yet, according to the timeline we are taught, many of these cities were still developing rapidly during that same period. Industrialization was accelerating, populations were exploding, infrastructure was expanding in every direction. And somehow, in the middle of all this transformation, entire districts of monumental architecture appeared. The deeper I looked into these photographs, the more I began to notice a pattern. Across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, the 19th century produced buildings that do not feel experimental or transitional. They feel finished, as if the architectural language had already reached a level of refinement that should have taken generations to develop. That observation raises a quiet but fascinating question. Why do so many buildings from the 1800s appear far more advanced than the era we usually associate them with? The traditional explanation is actually quite reasonable at first glance. By the 19th century, architecture had already accumulated thousands of years of knowledge. Builders were drawing from classical traditions that stretched back to ancient Greece and Rome. Renaissance architects had revived those forms centuries earlier, and by the time industrial cities began to grow, those design languages were widely understood. Stone carving techniques, masonry, and structural engineering were also highly developed. Skilled craftsmen had been refining these methods for generations. In other words, when we see a 19th century courthouse that resembles a Roman temple, it does not necessarily mean the builders were inventing something entirely new. They were applying established traditions that had already proven themselves over centuries. Industrialization also played an important role. Railways made transporting stone and iron easier. Factories produced standardized building components. Large workforces could be organized more efficiently than in earlier centuries. When you combine classical design traditions with industrial logistics, the result could indeed be monumental buildings constructed faster than people might expect. That explanation makes sense. And for many structures, it is probably entirely accurate. But when you continue examining photographs from that period, the situation becomes slightly more complex, because the architectural maturity visible in many 19th century cities does not appear gradually. In many places, it appears suddenly. Entire streets lined with elaborate stone buildings seem to emerge almost fully formed in historical records. Urban centers that were relatively modest only decades earlier suddenly contain enormous civic structures, railway terminals, theaters, museums, and administrative buildings that rival the grandeur of much older European capitals. The scale of this transformation is difficult to ignore. Cities were not simply expanding, they were redesigning themselves, and that transformation was happening across multiple continents at nearly the same moment in history. To understand why this feels unusual, we need to look at the broader context of 19th century urban growth. Between roughly 1800 and 1900, the population of many major cities multiplied several times over. Industrial economies created entirely new social structures, governments were suddenly responsible for managing transportation networks, sanitation systems, public administration, education, and cultural institutions for millions of residents. Cities had to reinvent themselves. Wide boulevards replaced narrow medieval streets. Public parks were introduced to improve living conditions. Monumental civic buildings were constructed to represent the authority and stability of modern governments. In some cases, entire districts were redesigned. Paris under Baron Haussmann is perhaps the most famous example. Large sections of the city were demolished and rebuilt with wide avenues and uniform stone architecture that still defines the city's appearance today. Other cities followed similar paths. Vienna developed its Grand Ringstrasse. London expanded its public institutions. American cities constructed enormous train stations, courthouses, and libraries as symbols of national ambition. When viewed through this lens, the impressive architecture of the 19th century begins to look less mysterious and more like the visible result of enormous social change. Cities were announcing their arrival into the modern world. But there is still something intriguing about how quickly this transformation occurred. Because if you look closely at the photographs, you begin to see that these buildings were not merely functional, they were monumental. When I first started comparing photographs from different cities of the same period, one detail kept capturing my attention. Confidence. The architecture of the 19th century often feels extraordinarily confident in its proportions and design language. Buildings from that era rarely appear tentative. They do not look like prototypes or early attempts at something still evolving. Instead, they seem to belong to a tradition that already understands itself very well. Grand staircases align perfectly with central domes. Columns are placed with mathematical precision. Entire facades maintain symmetrical harmony from one end of the structure to the other. This level of compositional clarity suggests something interesting. Architects of that period were not experimenting blindly. They were working within design systems that had already matured. And perhaps that is the key to understanding why these buildings sometimes appear more advanced than we expect. What we are actually seeing may not be the beginning of modern architecture. We may be seeing the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge finally expressed on an industrial scale. Once cities had the resources, labor, and materials to build at large scale, architectural traditions that had been developing slowly for generations suddenly had the opportunity to manifest everywhere at once. It is almost as if the 19th century turned the volume up on architectural history. Another important factor often overlooked is the quiet partnership between classical design and industrial materials. While the facades of many 19th century buildings appear ancient in style, their internal structures were often surprisingly modern. Iron beams, steel frames, and reinforced foundations allowed architects to construct larger interior spaces than traditional stone structures could easily support. Train stations, exhibition halls, and markets began using metal frameworks hidden behind decorative facades. This hybrid approach produced a fascinating visual illusion. From the outside, buildings appeared rooted in classical antiquity. Inside, they were already stepping into the engineering world of the 20th century. In some ways, the 19th century was not simply copying the past, it was blending the past and the future into a single architectural language, and that may be why these buildings still feel so powerful today. They occupy a unique moment in time, when craftsmanship, historical design traditions, and emerging industrial engineering briefly aligned. What makes the story even more interesting is how widely this architectural transformation spread from Paris to New York, from Vienna to Buenos Aires, from London to St. Petersburg. The same pattern appears again and again. Cities were building monumental structures that combined classical aesthetics with modern infrastructure. Libraries, railway stations, opera houses, and government buildings often shared similar architectural languages, even when they were separated by oceans. This was not coincidence. Architects studied abroad. Engineering ideas circulated rapidly through books and exhibitions. International fairs showcased new construction techniques, and design trends, the world was becoming more connected. Architecture reflected that connection. When we see similarities between buildings in different countries during this period, we are actually witnessing one of the earliest examples of global architectural dialogue. Cities were learning from one another, and the results were extraordinary. So, when we look at 19th century buildings that appear surprisingly advanced, the answer may not lie in a single hidden explanation. Instead, it may lie in a convergence of forces that rarely align so perfectly. Centuries of architectural knowledge, industrial materials and transportation, rapid urban expansion, and a cultural moment when cities wanted to express confidence, ambition, and permanence through monumental design. The 19th century did not invent architecture, but it gave architecture something it had rarely possessed before: the scale to reshape entire cities in a single generation. And perhaps that is why these buildings still capture our imagination today. They remind us that history does not always progress slowly. Sometimes, when the conditions are right, entire landscapes can transform almost overnight. If you look closely at the buildings around your own city, you may notice similar patterns, structures that seem older, stronger, or more deliberate than the streets surrounding them. And that observation leads to a fascinating realization. The cities we live in today are not single creations. They are layered environments shaped by generations of builders whose work continues to influence the world long after their own era has passed. If you enjoy exploring the hidden stories behind architecture and infrastructure, there are many more questions still waiting beneath the surface of our cities, and sometimes the answers are closer than we think.